welcome everyone to this webinar. We're just letting people join, so we'll start in a moment or two. Still see quite a few of you coming in and joining, so just give it a few moments. All right, let's make a start, shall we? I say welcome everyone to this webinar and thanks for joining us. My name's Rachel Garnham. I'm Vice Chair of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy and one of Labour Outlook's regular contributors. And I'm really excited to be part of this event discussing why Socialists support a united Ireland, something that we don't discuss on the left often enough and couldn't have come at a better time given developments in the north. So as you'll be aware, today's forum is organised by Labour Outlook, which is a fast growing left news website bringing you daily updates and opinions from across the broad spectrum of Labour's left and from those at the forefront of resisting the attacks from our terrible Tory government and also right-wing governments internationally and promoting an international agenda. So although this has been on the calendar for several months and is a discussion that's always relevant, it is a particularly timely discussion in light of the latest developments, including the growing crises within unionism, and hopefully that's something our speakers will cover. For many of us active in solidarity with the Irish cause over the years and decades, it's further confirmation of our need to again step up this work, including through building links with the left and progressive movements in Ireland and making the case in Britain for a border poll. And that's an argument we need to take into the Labour Party and the broader Labour movement and make sure the left understands why it's important and relevant to us. Just a bit about my own background in this space. I was privileged over 20 years ago now as a student and an activist in Young Labour to take part in a number of political delegations organised by the Troops Out movement to the north of Ireland, meeting those involved in the struggle, enjoying the West Belfast Festival and taking part in the demonstrations that marked the anniversaries of internment. And it was an important part of my political education, breaking out beyond what we normally discuss in the Labour Party and recognising that in Britain we're in the belly of the beast, and it's an area of international struggle that we don't really pay enough attention to as the Labour left, despite being right on our doorstep. So it's a very necessary discussion for those of us interested in building an anti-imperialist left here in Britain in light of Britain's colonial role in Ireland. And to discuss this today, we're joined by Francie Molloy MP from Sinn Fein. Francie was first elected an MP in 2013 and has been a Sinn Fein candidate in different elections since 1982. He was the MLA for Mid-Ulster from 1998 to 2013, including being Principal Deputy Speaker, and he is understandably a great advocate of the cause of Irish unity and numerous struggles for social justice, peace and equality. Our second speaker will be Geoff Bell, part of the recently formed Labour for Irish Unity and author of numerous important books on this topic, including Hesitant Comrades, the Irish Revolution and the British Labour Movement, and it will be great to hear from both. In terms of the format, we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible. We've left plenty of time for that. Because of the size of the audience, with hundreds of you joining us already, we've got volunteers who are going to facilitate that through the Q&A function on Zoom. So please do post both your comments for discussion and your questions to the speakers in the Q&A function, and we'll have time for plenty of those after the speakers. And during the event, you can also tweet Labour Outlook, which is at Labour Outlook. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our first speaker, Francie Molloy, and Francie will tell us why Socialists should support a united Ireland. Over to you, Francie.
Thank you very much, and it is an honour and a privilege for me to take part in the discussion debate this evening, and as someone who like yourself, Rachel, actually had attended many meetings in Britain around Troops Out and the various different campaigns, Time to Go, all the different issues that come up at different times. But so why socialists should support the United Ireland? And about socialism at its core, like republicanism, is about democracy, exercising democratic control over every aspect of people's lives. As socialists and democrats, we should support Irish unity. For the northeastern part of my country, the historic nation of Ireland, it has been ruled from the British capital for so many years and against the will of the Irish people. For to be controlled by your neighbour in any situation is undemocratic and is not correct. One of the things that we should remember all the time is that the Irish people in 1918 voted for independence, voted to set up their own Dáil, and voted to actually abstain from Westminster. And Sinn Fein have continued to do that over the years. For Democrats everywhere, the reality is that an Irish people living in the north is a British subject. And this is not something that we look for or wanted, and we want out of that situation. The Good Friday Agreement established the political institutions in the north, and with the north-south institutions coming together, it created a major change and a step up in the right direction. But unfortunately, it was still under the control of the British of when we actually would call the referendum on Irish unity. And as such, it was left to the Secretary of State. One of the defects, I think, of the Good Friday Agreement is that it left it to the British Secretary of State to decide when a referendum would be actually called, whereas there should have been a joint authority on that situation of when. So I am living in the north, and the one thing that the Good Friday Agreement did for me was it gave me a vision of what was possible, a way of actually achieving Irish unity by peaceful means, and included a lot more people in the struggle for independence than what had been able to take part before. It established the institutions, which, as I say, were a major development, and but we need to actually have them fully implemented before we can get the full benefits of that. One of the results of what is actually happening with British control is that they control the economic development of the island, and the block grant that we receive in Stormont means that British control what Stormont does, what Stormont can pay us money on. A few years back, whenever Stormont decided to try and deal with the welfare cuts and austerity from the Conservative government, we actually found that the British government imposed penalties on Stormont and blocked money coming through the block grant. So we don't have independence or control. And one of the results of that is that the north is the slowest growing economy on these islands. GDP per head of in the north is about 80% of what the British output per citizen. There's a greater number of low-paid jobs in the north than in the south of Ireland or any other region within Britain. The wages in these jobs are some of the lowest, and the fact that most jobs are public jobs, they are not on the line of the development of the natural resources within it. And the jobs that have been created because local people, in fighting discrimination and fighting job losses, actually set up their own industry. And particularly in the west of the Van, the west of the north, there's very little industry has been created by the state. It has been created by local people unemployed, and local people saying, I can do that in my own backyard. And we actually then set up industry to try and deal with that. Some 20% of the workers earn less than the basic living wage, which is actually the problems that we actually have in how the economy is actually working and how we. So in a united Ireland, the political representatives would directly deal with the issues that affect the public and make the decisions which would be a benefit to their own citizens, and would have full access to borrowing, taxation, European development, investment funds, all the rest of it. Even in Stormont, whenever we pushed for to use the European Investment Bank from the Stormont because it was dependent on the Black Grant. The British government stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. It has to come through the British government. And part of their thinking and reason for was because they were going to have to contribute to that. So they would not allow the people to actually make a decision within the Assembly to actually create industry, to create job improvement and to try and help along with that. So the removal of partition would be one of the major steps forward. It has failed abysmally and it hasn't given any sort of solidarity even with the people across the island of Ireland. It has created two separate states, the one looking south, one looking north, back to back. It has created two of everything, education systems, health service, everything that we actually said about is working in two separate directions and in two different ways. And that has actually led to not only the partition of the border situation, but actually partition of the people themselves in looking in different directions. So we need the people of Ireland to be able to come together to decide its own future. And we're 100 years now into partition. And as I say, it has failed completely, but it's time for change. And that is happening. Once partition is removed, the whole host of economic and social opportunities, they are unlocked within the island of Ireland, but also within these islands, that you can have a better relationship with somebody that you're doing it in a voluntary way than somebody who's imposing control from Westminster over you. So the island of Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, I believe could actually have a better relationship in the future. And it would be one of the benefits for the Labour. I remember sometimes in meetings, people would have said, well, you don't need independence in Ireland because when we get a socialism across these islands, we'll have a different state. But we do need independence. We need sovereignty in order to actually move forward. And we need that recognition of the Irish nation as a people to actually decide their own future. That was part of the idea of the Good Friday Agreement. It gave people a vision of what was possible and what could be done. The Good Friday Agreement was like the North Star on matters relating to constitutional future of Ireland. The British Labour Party played a key role within that. And I remember meeting with Mo Molan before Labour came into government, meeting with Mo Molan on a regular basis for 12 months before it, discussing what the issues were, what needed to be done, the fears that some people actually have with that loyalism would just run rampage over it and actually the people couldn't exist. And as I said to Mo at that time, we have lived within that for the last, I have lived over the last 50 years. And we are now ready to actually take that on. We will take on that challenge. Don't you worry about that. And we need the Labour Party to come into government and to take things on hand and deal with them. And to be fair with them, they did. They may have many other problems that we would have seen with Tony Blair, but certainly we did see that he came into government, took action and delivered within the Good Friday Agreement. And that brought together the key players in the South and with the Americans and the British government. But the key bit about all of this here is the British government is a key player within it in both a negative way, but in this occasion was in a very positive way. The key component of the Good Friday Agreement was the principle of consent, that the North of Ireland would only remain British until such times that the majority wished to change the status quo. And for the first time in history, the political route to reunification was available to us. We didn't have it before. We were fighting for those rights and fighting for that demand. It made the British government's claim in the North conditional, where before that, and up until 1998, it was absolute. They had complete control and there was no way out for the people of the North. So it gave a vision for the people of the North. It gave them an outlet that actually that could work with. And as I said, it engaged with a lot more people than those who could engage in the struggle up to that particular time. And that was a very important point because it gave everybody a part to play, as Bobby Sands said. The Good Friday Agreement was overwhelmingly endorsed by the people right across the island of Ireland, North and South. And there was a great vision there and a great uplift of people that actually could whether you're from Cork or from Kerry or from Donegal or anywhere in the north, that you could have a part to play, that you had very much that opportunity to vote for Irish unity in the form of the Good Friday Agreement. The referendum, what it needs to be called, has to be called, as I said, by the Secretary of State, the British Secretary of State. And there is an obligation on the British Secretary of State that he shall lay before Parliament such proposals that give effect to that wish. So the people of the North decided they wanted to join with the rest of Ireland in reunification, then the Secretary of State is compelled to bring into legislation through the British government to make that happen, and the Irish government to do likewise in relation to the implementation of that. In other words, the Secretary is compelled to have a referendum. The problem at the moment is that they haven't set down the criteria for what that referendum, when it should be held. And at the moment, they're prevaricating on that. Nobody will say, including Labour, won't actually say what their criteria would be for to have a referendum on Irish unity. And we need that to happen to move things along. And the big thing that we're reaching that threshold of change was happening. The very fact that 8 out of the 18 constituencies, 11 voted to remain within the European Union. So that's a measure. It's not a complete measure on the same issue, but it is a measure of how people, and they weren't all nationalists, who voted to remain within the European Union. And the only way that that's going to happen in the future is that there will be a united Ireland. And thankfully, the European Union have agreed that if there was a united Ireland in the morning, then that the people of all of Ireland would be within the European Union. No renegotiating of that. The island of Ireland would be within the European Union. So it's a very important one. But unfortunately, the British government, because it was a referendum across what they call the UK, it meant that the North was taken out of the European Union against its will. Majority of people, 56%, voted to remain with Europe, but they were taken out of that against its will, which was undemocratic, and the North really had no say whenever that situation happened. We are very critical of the European Union in general. We're not naive to say that everything that happens within the European Union is good and perfect, but we have a critical analysis of it, and we continue to deal with that. Our MEPs in the past have actually done that, and will continue to do that. But there is a very important role that Europe has played within both the peace process, the negotiations, and the financial support that happened afterwards. And I would be quite confident that if you had a vote for Irish unity in the morning, and all of Ireland within the European Union, that the financial resources would come in to erode the border and to deal with some of the anomalies that actually have happened in the last 50 years, and actually start to deal with the revitalization of the entire island of Ireland. And there's no doubt, like Germany, in a similar situation when it brought together, it thrived. There was a lot of people actually had fears, and a lot of people in Ireland have fears. But I am confident that we can actually deliver that, and that the funding will follow that to make it happen. So 2021 marks 100 years of partition. The unions would like to say it marked 100 years of the Stormont. Stormont is over. Stormont actually was prorogued by Willie Whitelaw, Secretary of State, 50 years ago. So the Stormont Parliament, as was known, is over. We have now an assembly in the North, and that we need to actually deal with that reality of what we actually have and to move on. People are examining the legacy of partition, the good and the bad of it. When the Northern state was brought into being by the force of arms and the threat of the force of arms, and maintained by the threat of arms, maintained by the B specials, by the military presence, and whenever that wasn't enough in the North, then they brought in the British Army, not to protect nationalists, but to protect British interests in Ireland. And that has been one of the flaws that people sometimes saw, that the British Army were brought in to protect the nationalist people and for civil rights. It didn't. It actually protected the British interests in Ireland, and has continued to do that for the last number of years. But the big change that happened, when the North and the Stormont were set up, they would have said that the British, those who are pro-British, had a majority in the North. But that has all changed. since the since Assembly election of 2017, no, every election since that, the unions no longer have a majority in the north. The unions are playing second fiddle to that situation. Because of the combined nature, the figures can sometimes mislead that. But at the end of the day, the unions have lost the majority. And so the basis for Stormont, the basis for the 6-county statelet has actually ended. The democratic trends within the traditional nationalist background are likely to form a majority in the north in the coming years. And the shortcoming, the census, which is not a great figure for actually giving the real facts and figures at this point in time, because it takes that long to analyze them. But the census are indicating that there will be a nationalist majority within 2 to 3 years' time. And that doesn't mean that everybody within that will actually vote, or every Catholic would actually vote for United Ireland, but not every Protestant would actually vote for it to remain British. Those, as I say, that want to be part of the European Union, then they actually can be part of the European Union. And there are many unions that I speak to who actually would prefer to have be part of the European Union. Young people want to remain part of the European Union. And so the future is bright in relation to the demographics of how that's actually work. I think, crucially, we're looking now at an assembly election of May 2022. It might come sooner than that, and we will take that as it comes. But the reality at the present time, as you know, is unionism is further fragmented. The Democratic Unionist Party, that actually were the major unionist party, are now fragmenting as well. There is no, at the present time, within the seats in the Assembly, it's level pegging of Sinn Fein and the DUP, and there's question marks over one seat of how that would play out. So Sinn Fein may, in a short period of time, have a larger number of seats in the Assembly than the DUP. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't change things right away, because the Assembly is based on the election, the last election, and the total number of seats and total number of votes that were cast at that particular time. So it won't change anything immediately, but it does send a clear picture of what the future is likely to be. And with Sinn Féin's growth in the south of Ireland, it's most likely that Sinn Féin will become part of the next government in the south. We should have been part of this one because we were the largest party when it came out of the last elections. The coalition that had been formed, that changed that. But that's the way things are going to be within Ireland and within the south of Ireland. We're not going to have one party state in the foreseeable future. So you're going to have a coalition government. And that's why I say that unionism has a major part to play within that, because they can be part of that coalition government. They have a major vote that actually has to be recognised. And we want to see them as partners within a coalition government in all Ireland. And they will be a more effective force within that All Ireland structure than there will be being just a prop up to a British government, as the Conservatives used the DUP in the last election until prop them up until they then got a majority, and then as soon as that happened, they just dumped them. So we want unionism to be a real player in the formation of a new government. And in that way, then I think we actually can see the real voice of unionism in an All Ireland, not somebody interpreting it, not somebody playing it, but actually somebody really living it and fighting for their own people and fighting for the issues that they actually wanted. And I think, you could have a coalition government of Sinn Féin and the unionists in the north and the same in the south if unionism become part of that structure. And a lot of the research work that has been done by different universities that are indicating that everybody's talking about United Ireland. Everybody's talking about a referendum, and everybody's talking about what form the United Ireland should take. It's not a case of actually just joining the 6 counties onto the 26 counties and continuing on as though nothing changed. It needs to be a new Ireland. It needs to have new structures and new recognitions within the future. So we don't want a situation where the North is just tagged on and we continue. We want to be part of it. We may even need to keep the Northern Assembly in place in a transition across the island of Ireland. So that becomes part and parcel of that. I think I'm running out of time.
You can have a minute or two, Francie.
I'm getting the message here. So, but as I say, the discussion for United Ireland is very much there. We want Labour to become part of that discussion. We want Labour to become the persuaders for unity. And I believe that once that discussion opens up and people drop their fears of what the future may be, then we will have a prosperous United Ireland and a prosperous unity of the islands across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland in socialism. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I was very struck by the proposition that we allow the people of Ireland to determine their own future. It seems quite straightforward, doesn't it? So we're going to very briefly have a contribution from Matt Wilgris from Labour Outlook, who's going to tell us a bit more about today's organisers and what you can do to support. Matt.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to our speakers. Also, I want to do a quick thank you to Patrick, the multiple Bens, Sam, Sean, Amy, and the other volunteers. As some people involved with Labour Outlook will know, I was due to speak at a number of meetings this year, including this one, but I haven't been able to because I'm suffering with long COVID. Although I feel much better now, it's a great credit to all those volunteers to keep it going and to have meetings as large and regular as these. For those of you who don't know what Labour Outlook is, Labour Outlook is a website news source which is updated daily. It came out of Arise, a festival of Labour's left ideas, which Geoff and others have spoke at, which started in 2018 and was a very successful physical event in 2018 and 19. Last year has been an online event for obvious reasons. And Labour Outlook was sort of created by the volunteers from that festival to try and put that politics on a sort of more regular and communicating message. And we also, last week, some people on the People's Assembly demo would have seen our first kind of physical newsletter that Rachel and others were featured in. And the sort of reason why we're calling these forums, and this is the fourth of them, is to try and give people a chance for an in-depth explanation on why we as socialists should take on some of these issues and have these issues. We had the discussion about anti-imperialism and why socialists be anti-imperialist. We had a discussion about why socialists stand with the global Palestinian resistance. Now we have this important discussion on Ireland. And I think, as Rachel pointed to, for the left here in Britain, it's important to understand Britain's role that continues in Ireland, its historical, awful role, colonial role in Ireland, and to understand that that means it does affect us. And, you know, if you go back long enough, you can look at what Marx and Engels said later in their lives when they developed very clear lines on Ireland and why the Labour movement here must break from a sort of unionism and back Irish self-determination, and the kind of idea that the working class here will never be free until Ireland is free. And the reaction here, which I think is a very important point, is strengthened and fostered by the enslavement of Ireland. So I'm delighted that we're able to host this discussion today. Sorry that I can't make my more lengthy contribution, but also do please support Labour Outlook. Please donate at the link if you can, because obviously it's a volunteer operation. Events like this actually cost hundreds of pounds each to put on, with webinar, streaming and other costs. And so does the website and the publications. Please do have a look at that newsletter I mentioned and download and read it. And please do follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks from us as Labour Party activists to all the volunteers at Labour Outlook and the Arise Festival for really upping your game in terms of political education, because yeah, it's the priority you put on it is really important for all of us. So our second speaker is Geoff Bell from Labour for Irish Unity. Over to you, Geoff. Just need to unmute yourself, I'm afraid. That's it.
Right, there we go. Yes, thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks everybody for inviting both myself and Labour for Irish Unity to talk to this meeting. So I am sort of speaking, if you like, as a member of the Labour Party, and in that respect, I want to explore three different questions. The first is, what is our actual current policy on Ireland? The second, what should it be? And the third is, what is the source of the current political crisis in the north of Ireland? So what is Labour's current policy on Ireland and in the north of Ireland? And what are the differences between that and what the Tories say? Now, at the last election, the manifesto said the policy was to support the Good Friday Agreement. But then, of course, everybody says that. The DUP have recently accused the British government of breaking the GFA. I'm going to speak to the Good Friday Agreement as the GFA from now on, right? So the DUP has recently accused the British government of breaking the GFA over Brexit. But the fact is, of course, that the DUP opposed the GFA when it was signed, and eventually, indeed, they received majority support for this stand. So saying that the GFA is now sort of sacrosanct, as both they and the rest of the world, including the Labour Party, including our party, say, doesn't really take us all that far. We need details, we need clarification on the implementation of the GFA and other parts of the peace process which followed. So, for instance, what indeed is our stand? What is the party stand on the border poll referendum as allowed for in the GFA and other aspects of the peace process? And as far as I am concerned, I think Francis talked about this, as far as I'm concerned, this has never been actually clarified. And what is our stand on the enactment of Irish language equality, which is also promised in the GFA? Now, the interesting thing is that the Tories have now said that they will legislate for this if the Northern Ireland Assembly does not. But our party, the Labour Party, as far as I'm aware, have never said what its policy on this is. In fact, I've asked at a number of fringe meetings at Labour Party questions Northern Ireland spokesmen what that is, and they've never said. It is never actually pressed for implementation of this promise. So we now have the rather sad situation that the Tories appear to be more progressive on this by promising to implement on it than Labour has been in the last few years. And there are many other difficulties with the implementation of the peace process. The DUP, for instance, is currently boycotting various cross-border institutions agreed by the GFA. Many of these have barely functioned in the past. Indeed, some have never been set up. Have we ever pointed this out as a party? Do we criticise the DUP on this? No, we do not. And we have not done in the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, I'm not just slacking off the current Labour Party sort of leadership of this. It hasn't happened for years. And there also remain important promises in the latest stage of the peace process. The New Decades, New Approach agreement, which was signed in 2020, and the aspects of that remain unfulfilled. These includes a Human Rights Act, and it does seem incredible, really, that we are still waiting for a Human Rights Act in Northern Ireland over 50 years after the Northern Ireland civil rights movement first took to the streets. Other aspects of this agreement which haven't been seen are the All-Ireland Community Forum, which is another promise of the GFA and other aspects of the peace process. And if this sort of took place, it would allow various communities throughout the 30 counties and people throughout the 32 counties to actually talk about and discuss what a new Ireland could look like. But this forum has never been sort of set up. In fact, it's been sort of watered down. Even the proposals have been sort of watered down. And the unionists have ensured that this has not happened. So the point I'm trying to make is that simply saying we support the Good Friday Agreement is not enough. What we need is a detailed policy on how we implement it. And most obvious of all, that does indeed include a policy on the referendum, including when it should be called and what that process should actually be. Which brings me to the sort of second question concerning what our sort of policy should be, specifically with respect to the issues the border poll raises. Now, I'm going to go back more than a few years and mention what our policy once was. When the party conference agreed to support Irish unity by consent, and then a policy to be, as Francie actually mentioned the word, persuaders for Irish unity. Now, that policy was adopted at a party conference in the mid-1980s. Now, then many of us campaigned for much more than that, and sort of troops out and so on and so on. But nevertheless, mainly as a result of the campaigns which were launched at that time, we secured this change. Labour's Peter Archer stood up in the House of Commons and said, I'm going to quote here, "We have been honest and open with the unionist people about our view of the future. We believe that the future of Ireland should be one country. We do not delude ourselves that the unionist people agree with us, but disagreeing is better than misleading people." Now, let me be honest about this. Neither Peter Archer nor the then party leader, in fact, much more the more then Peter party leader, Neil Kinnock, who was leader at the time, are my political heroes. You know, I mean, I wouldn't say that for one second. But that really makes my point. If we could have that policy then under that leadership, why can we not have it now? In fact, is it not now more sort of obvious and necessary and clearly the better way forward than it was even then? So that brings me to the sort of final question: why is Northern Ireland in the crisis it now is? Now, of course, there are contemporary circumstances, notably Brexit and that Boris Johnson cannot be trusted in it, his broken promises and so on. Well, you know, Carmen, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. This is not the first time British politicians have broken promises on Ireland. You know, it's part of the DNA, really. You know, I mean, for instance, when Ireland, as sort of Francie was mentioned, when Ireland was first partitioned in 1921, the British Prime Minister promised that a border commission would be established and would cut down the territory of the new Northern Ireland state to such an extent that would become untenable. And then it would be united, the sort of northern state would be united with the rest of the new state established in the south. But of course, that did not happen.
2 minutes, Geoff.
Sorry,
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Oh, right. Okay. I'd sort of carry on a bit. Yeah. So anyway, so that it did not happen. So what did actually happen? A state was established, which could only survive because the minority of Catholics was 33%. A state was established which could only survive by denying the rights and discriminating against Catholics. And that, if you like, is the story of the Northern state in a sort of nutshell. So the reason for things like Bloody Sunday, Ballymurphy, the reasons for the discrimination was because of the built-in nature of the sectarian state. And the truth is that those who speak of, quote, our precious union, those who wrap themselves in the sort of Union Jack, are defending the indefensible. And the reason the majority of unionists in Northern Ireland have came to oppose the Good Friday Agreement was because it did and has challenged the sectarian nature of the state. But the GFA and indeed Brexit have also exposed the weaknesses, the instability of that six-county formation, and the whole lack of common sense and logic in dividing Ireland as Britain did in the first place. So we're living with those consequences. And that is what should end. And that is why we should echo Peter Archer in saying the future of Ireland should be as one country. Thank you.
Oh, spot on. Thank you, Geoff. Thanks very much. And yeah, really interesting. We've had loads of wide-ranging and insightful questions, so I'm gonna try and get through them as many as possible. I'm gonna take them in threes. So I'll just read out the first set. These which all relate to the referendum issue, which has already been discussed to some extent. So George McManus, does Francie have any idea of a timeline for a referendum? Given that Labour may not be in power for some time, will he be making a submission to Westminster for a referendum anytime in the near future, if only to put Johnson on the spot? Linked to this, with what must be the mess and disillusionment caused by Brexit, is it now likely that any Westminster Tory or right of centre Labour government would call for a referendum? If they were afraid before, they must be even more afraid now. So and someone else asked, linked to, if there was a referendum in the north in the near future, does unification have the numbers to win? And I know Francie's already sort of referred to that. So I think, yeah, this is about the likelihood timescale for a referendum, and perhaps also what can we do to make Labour a bit more explicit in its support for such a thing if possible. Francie, come to you first.
Yes, well, first of all, the timeline is not agreed, and we have pushed every Secretary of State and every shadow Secretary of State to set out what the criteria was and what would make them make that decision. What are they basing that on? Because if they're saying it's not now, is not the time, and it's too soon, what are they basing that on? So we do need to have a criteria, and unfortunately, the Good Friday Agreement didn't set a criteria for that. So it needs to be formed now. And the last time we had meetings with the Shadow Secretary of State and the Secretary of State and with the British Prime Ministers, we actually have emphasising that we do need, because there's a commitment within the Good Friday Agreement, and we need to know what measurements are being used to analyse the figure. Now, I give the example of the fact that 56% voted to remain in Europe as one measurement within it. But what we're saying is any referendum that is called must be based on what the Good Friday Agreement said was 50% plus one. And this was the first time, and was one of the things that was an encouragement to nationalists to buy into the Good Friday Agreement. First time that it actually had been set a figure of 50% plus one. Now others are saying you would want a lot bigger percentage. Yes, you would want a lot bigger percentage, but that's democracy, and that has been a good enough majority in so many other situations, like the Brexit and other referendums that have been held. So if it's good enough there, it's good enough in this situation. But we would encourage, to try and get 75%, whatever the case may be, and we want to have unionism playing a major part in that discussion. The big thing actually we want is that the discussion starts now. Whenever the referendum is held is one thing, but the discussion about the referendum. So if we don't finish up like Brexit, with no information, with wrong information, with false information, we want to have the proper discussion. Even the Scottish referendum was very well held and a lot of documentation put forward, but still it come down to a sort of not enough information for the people to actually make. And again, people, prime ministers and ministers and politicians coming in at the last minute promising the sun, the moon and the stars for Scotland if they stayed, and yet the day afterwards all those promises were broken, which again, as Geoff said, that's typical in that time. So what we want is the discussions about the referendum, what the referendum will ask, what the questions will be, what the information will be, and the British government have to be persuaders in this situation, because if the people voted for a referendum, then their job is to implement it, not to prevaricate any further on that.
Thank you, Geoff.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of come in on it, I think, and again, I'm trying to sort of address how sort of we can sort of help this, because obviously, if we have a sort of situation in sort of a couple of years' time, even looking at sort of medium term, where, if you like, Sinn Fein are the leading party in the Assembly and possibly the lead government in the Irish government, it is clear there will be a lot of pressure built up in sort of Ireland for a referendum. And indeed, there is a lot of grassroots organising going on, apart from what sort of Sinn Fein and other sort of parties are sort of doing about this. I mean, there's a real pressure building up. And again, it is absolutely scandalous in sort of my view that the Labour Party has nothing to say in that. I mean, I wouldn't even mind if they walked out in a sort of 12th of July with sort of lambeg drums and blah blah blah. Well, I would mind, but at least they would be saying something, you know, on this. I mean, they've said absolutely nothing. So I mean, I think we have to build up pressure within the party, establish a policy on what sort of referendum is. So I mean, if we can sort of do that, then, you know, if we can say, ask questions, and you have to ask questions of the Tory government, and you have to make this an issue, what is your policy on that? Then we have something to discuss, then we have something to argue about, then we have something to sort of formulate. So I think that is why, as I say, we have formed, one of the reasons why we have formed Labour for Irish Unity, to build up pressure to discuss questions like this, because it really is important, as I think, you know, Rachel said as well, you know, that the traditions of the past with a real campaigning organisation and activity in sort of Ireland, not just for the sake of Ireland, but for sort of opening up why these questions are important for sort of socialists generally. So, you know, when it's going to happen is, obviously it is not dependent on what the Labour Party do or dependent on what the activists in the sort of party would actually do, but it would certainly help that process if the voice for that is sort of louder than it is now.
Yeah, thank you. Really useful answers. And I think what's clear is, although there's a map, you know, to a referendum, it starts now, and we have to keep discussing it, even if there's nothing formally on the agenda at the moment. So moving on to a next set of questions, which are almost looking beyond a referendum towards Irish unity. So Bridget asks, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to eventual reunification of the island of Ireland? Linked to this from Gilbert, how can unionists be reassured that their future will be better in a united Ireland? And on similar lines, how can unionists / loyalists be persuaded to accept reunification? That's from Dennis. And finally, sorry, I said I'd take them in threes. This is actually four, but I think they're sort of quite related, which is from Carol. How can this issue be separated from religion? So this is about sort of building a majority, I guess, in the north, and you know, what are the obstacles to reunification, given we already have a border in the Irish Sea now? Geoff, can I come to you this time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's be sort of honest sort of about this. During the referendum, we are very unlikely to get a majority of the unions supporting a united Ireland. I mean, I don't really think that's sort of very likely to sort of happen, but as sort of Francis has sort of said, the actual terms of that, you don't have to sort of get that, which doesn't mean we don't have to try and persuade unionists that this would be a sensible way forward. And I think some of the things Francis has said this afternoon about taking sort of unionists into a coalition government of 32 County Ireland is a very, very positive thing to actually say. The other thing, of course, how can this be separated from a religion? I mean, this is a long sort of history sort of about this, but I mean, I come from a Protestant background, and I remember somebody on the left said to me, you know, I think you've got a guilt complex about being a Protestant because you claim to be an Irish Republican. And I said, why should I have a guilt complex when it was Protestants who formed the Republican movement in the sort of first place, which was the United Irishmen of sort of with Tone, which was, you know, I think 23 members, and they were all Protestant, and 22 were sort of Presbyterians. And I come from a non-Presbyterian background, so I'm very proud of forming the United Irishmen. You know, sorry, Francis, you know, you Catholics didn't do it at that stage. You know, that's a joke. But, you know, so there is this other tradition. It's a minority tradition, but it's there, you know, and it can be built on. And there's this fellow who brought this book out recently called about dissident Presbyterians, which is hundreds of Presbyterians in a sort of Ireland as a whole, who over the last 150 years have been a much more radical tradition. So that tradition is actually there, and we can build on that, and we can sort of educate sort of about that. As I say, we're not going to win. The cause isn't going to win 50%, but I mean, we can break, I think, enough away, and indeed enough are now breaking away, right? Mainly from the middle class, it is true, but enough are sort of now sort of breaking away and sort of looking at this question, looking like things that the progressive policies which are happening sort of in the South, and I mean, Jeffrey Donaldson, let me just end with this. Jeffrey Donaldson, I was just looking up some of the speeches and stuff he made, who is the new leader of the DUP. Jeffrey Donaldson saying about 10 years ago that the only reason, he says, he said the main reason Protestants oppose a united Ireland is because they know it'll be Rome rule, you know, because that's the tradition, right? And now no one can say now, right, that a 32 county Ireland would be Rome rule. I mean, it's just not logical. It's just not a sensible thing to actually say. So I think the situation, sort of that sense, the changes that are taking place in the sort of South are very important. And this is why a number of people, a larger percentage of people from the Protestant community are now looking at this afresh.
Thank you. And Francie, over to you, just a reminder, obstacles to reunification, assuring unionists of their future in a united Ireland. Some issues.
Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles at the present time, and has been for some time, is the southern state and the politicians in the southern state who are quite happy with the status quo, who don't want anyone else coming in to threaten their positions. And they were able to build, unfortunately, after the success of the War of Independence and the setting up of the First Dáil, unfortunately, the counter-revolution that happened then actually put into state two conservative states, and they don't want to lose power or control. And we saw that particularly last year in the southern election. Whenever it was obvious that Sinn Fein should be a major player in a coalition, they were prepared to set up a coalition with anybody but Sinn Fein, other than actually recognise the vote of the people on the ground. So that's the biggest obstacle. And I suppose the other thing that we actually have is fear. The fear of the unknown has been part of it. And even in the north, the fear of the unknown, the welfare state. Whenever I was growing up, the one thing that I always heard people saying about United Ireland and the problems with United Ireland was, what about the family allowance? Who would pay a family allowance? Well, we know that the state itself, and we might criticise some of the aspects of the Irish state, but it now has a welfare system which is probably better than the north. It has benefits across from the European Union, which are better than what we're getting in the north, particularly now after Brexit. So I think there are many aspects there that have changed that will actually make it a different. But the message is not going out, and that's why the discussion about United Ireland needs to be opened up. The Irish government must lead that, so to give people all the information, all the facts, so they can make the judgment on their own. We don't want anybody to go into this United Ireland blindly. We want them to go in that they're comfortable with it. They may not like it, they may not want it, but that at least they have the facts and figures to actually say, well, that's the decision. In relation to the unionist future, I think one of the big things that is that we don't want done unto anyone else what was done to us. I think that's the key to it. We want people to be treated equally and to be given their rightful place, because we weren't, and we remember those particular bad days when we were second-class citizens. We weren't citizens at all, very much in the situation. So we certainly don't want that for anyone else in the future. I think the issue about religion very much has ratified itself. The idea of Rome rule, as Geoff says, no longer is a threat whatsoever. No, it's not a threat in the south of Ireland. It wouldn't be a threat in United Ireland. And I think the power and authority that the bishops and the clergy wielded, thankfully, is over. And the link between the state and the religious authorities is over. And they've largely destroyed that themselves. And the treatment of children and treatment of young people and the abuses that they actually meted out to the people, they have wiped that out themselves. So that, I think, thankfully, that day is over. And I wouldn't want to see anything that was controlled by the state and a religious authority of any kind. And I think we have a more neutral situation in that one. So the religion part of it, I think, is out of it. The other thing is, what would make people accept unification? Well, I can't speak for unionism in that sense, but I do believe that anyone wants to manage their own house, their own benefits, their own state. And so I would imagine that unionism would want to be part of making the laws, making the decisions, and making the regulations within an All-Ireland state or within any state. And even Dr. Paisley said to Martin McGuinness, we don't need British ministers coming over here to tell us how to run this place. And that was the first real recognition that, Ian Paisley, whatever people may say about him otherwise or think about him otherwise, the reality was that he wanted to run his own house. He wanted to run the North. And I remember having discussions around that with him, and it was very clear that he didn't want the British telling him what to do either. And I think that's the key for it. And what we want to be is part of. The example that I would give at the moment is within the councils. And I remember I was in the chair of Dungannon Council, and before the election came up, we actually set about bringing in the hunt mechanism, that after the next election, we would implement the hunt. And on that occasion, Nationalists got a majority in the council. And I remember one unionist councillor saying to me, I suppose that's the end of the hunt. And I said, no, that's the reason for the hunt, because we want to share the powers, with little powers that the council had, but we want to share them equally across, right down to the very independent councillor. And we did do that. And the hunt mechanism across the councils is one of the examples that I would give to unionism, that their future is safe within an All-Ireland, within a United Ireland, because that's the type of mechanism that I would want to see within any coalition government within an All-Ireland structure. And I think it can be done. I think we have proved it in the councils. And in everywhere there's a nationalist majority in the council, the hunt is brought in. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened within unionism, because as that councillor said to me, he says, I don't understand why you would get power and then give it away. But it's not exercising power against somebody or for them. It's actually working with people to exercise their power, because at the end of the day, all of this power is the people. And that's why we come back to the socialism, is that, if people recognize socialism and republicanism as a joint sort of process within it, that we can create a new Ireland which is better for everyone within it. And that's what we want to see in the future. And that's why I say, even in relation to the assembly, it may be that we actually keep the assembly in position for a transition period until it's no longer required or needed, but to give unionism a voice in both ends of it. And not just unionism. I would want to see that I would have a voice within an All-Ireland structure which would recognise the transition and the work that we actually have to do to bring that transition about. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really helpful way of explaining it. So these three questions are not in exactly themed, so you might want to just pick one or two. But a few people have asked, including Rob, could Francie explain to our newer audience why Sinn Fein MPs don't sit in the UK Parliament at Westminster? It's useful to rehearse those arguments. What lessons can we draw from the success of Sinn Fein in the last Irish general election as a clearly anti-austerity party? And I'm glad this one's made the cut, which is, could the speakers comment on the recent rulings regarding Bloody Sunday and also Ballymurphy? We were talking before people came on about the sort of awful news yesterday about, justice being denied once again, it appears. So really important question about the current situation there. Francie, shall I come to you first? Or do you need a breather?
Oh, okay. Thanking you, and thanks for the questions. The reason that Sinn Fein don't take our seats in Westminster is because we're a Republican party, and I think it would be contradictory for us to go into Westminster and swear an oath of allegiance to the British Queen. She's Queen of Britain, that's grand. But as Irish Republicans, we have no allegiance whatsoever to a British Queen. So it'd be totally wrong of us and hypocritical of us to go in and actually and swear an oath of allegiance in that situation. And we're Irish Republicans. We're elected as MPs from the North, and we want to see our seats being taken within the Dáil. We want speaking rights within the Dáil as at present, and hopefully we will get that in the near future. But really, we want to see the first Dáil was set up, and the first Dáil, the MPs went into that Dáil on the basis that they went into that election on the basis that they wouldn't take their seats, and they've lived up to that continuously, and we have lived up to that continuously, that we wouldn't take our seats because of that whole oath, and we want to see independence within it. The success of Sinn Féin, I think it does come down to hard working on the ground for constituents within constituencies and providing a good service on the ground, not being caught up in some of the problems in the past and the corruptions of the past that actually various different parties and governments in the South had got involved in. And I think the very fact that a state that was only, a fairly new state was actually involved in so much corruption and the investigations that had to happen, and that senior people within that finished up in jail because of corruption. I think, Sinn Féin's ground is about walking on the ground for the people. We're elected by the people, and I believe very strongly the old policies that Labour would have had and we would have had and others on the lines of actually, recalling people. If you elect someone and they don't keep within what they stood for in elections, then we should recall them people and change them. If that is the situation. So I think the policy, the socialist stuff is still very, very strong within it. In relation to the recent court hearings I think it is a good example of why we want independence. It's a good example of why we want away from British rule, because the British state didn't, if you look at the lines, they claimed us as citizens. They didn't protect us. They only protected one section of the community. They didn't protect nationalists right across the board. And so if they didn't want us and they didn't want to protect us, then why should they want to govern us? And I think, the key point of the rulings of the courts, it's prevarication. We done a meeting with Simon Coveney yesterday around this whole issue of Ballymurphy and the recent inquest. 50 years before they actually got the judgment last couple of weeks. So, that's an example of, if you're fighting 50 years, what the British state was doing was simply delaying, hopefully that the people who were coming next would have forgotten about it, that the other people would have died, and that there would be no inquiry to actually hold. So the same with Bloody Sunday. Like why the Cameron said it was wrong. So if it was wrong, then people should be brought to justice. And then the promise that one soldier was going to be charged, and now we're basically saying no, there's no soldier. And they're saying because of a court decision. That court decision was taken by the British state. It wasn't as though some independent body decided. The British court decided that they wouldn't prosecute the soldiers involved in the shootings in Belfast. So we need to actually, where is the judgments coming from? They're coming from the British state, and now they're using them judgments to deny people, the victims, some recess to. There has to be recourse to the courts, and within what we said to Simon Coveney, and he agrees that there should not be an amnesty should not be an amnesty overall, because people deserve justice and deserve to have the information of what happened to their loved ones.
Thank you. Geoff?
Yeah, very, very, very briefly on that. I think the first thing has to be said that I think the statement from Louise Haig yesterday, who is the Labour Party spokesperson on Northern Ireland, she was quite critical of the sort of judgment which stopped the trial of these Bloody Sunday soldiers. So I think that has to be said, that was a very hopeful statement which she made. And of course the whole issue, and again it actually sort of illustrates to an extent broken sort of promises, because under the agreement I sort of talked about, the sort of 2021, the new sort of decade, the British government signed up to starting a process in which these historic crimes, if you like, would actually be sort of brought to court, more or less. They actually signed up for that, and then 3 months afterwards, they said that they were given 3 months to come up with the process how this would happen, and then after 3 months, they says no, we're not going to come up with that process. And more than that, we're not even going to sort of carry out any time, and they expect any sort of day now to sort of announce a sort of amnesty, which sort of cuts sort of everything out. You know, the whole thing is it's like British sort of justice. You know, British justice strikes again. It reminds me of the whole thing. You know, this is probably a sort of misquote, but a rough quote of it. Sort of Gandhi was asked, you know, when he said, well. Mr. Gandhi, when he arrived at British shores one time, and he was asked, well, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of English civilization? And he says, yeah, that would be a good idea. You know, and I think you can say the same about British justice and the historic thing. Well, that would be a sort of good idea. I mean, the fact is, both in Ballymurphy, it's not a question of a couple of rotten apples doing nasty things, because both in Ballymurphy and in the Bloody Sunday since the Savile inquiry, the British state have sabotaged both these judicial processes, laid them down, told soldiers not to sort of appear at various hearings and so on and so on. So it's not something which is 50 years ago. It's been going on ever since. And I mean, that, if you sort of sums up why the whole rotten thing is just, you know, it's, you know, we sort of come to expect that, if you like, now, because that is par for the course, right? And that's why we have to play in a different course from now on. You know?
Rachel, if I could just come in for a minute, I live in an area known as the Murder Triangle. My fields run down to the centre of that Murder Triangle, which was Bond's plantation, or the Agri, a National Trust property now, and the collusion between RUC, the British Army, the UDR, and the Loyalist paramilitaries in carrying out 120 murders in that whole area, you know, and them and the Glenanne gang and other gangs, you know, carried out those things with the authority of the British Army, with the authority of the British government in that sense. And it was very interesting that Agri House in 1914, when the UVF were gun running into Larne, the weapons were brought, or a lot of them were brought there to the Agri for storage for the UVF in 1914. And when the UVF reconvened this time, they set up again in the very same place. And the British state were part and parcel of both operations. So, you know, 120 murders, and no one has ever been convicted. No British soldier has been convicted around that. And they're talking about facetious investigations and prosecutions. No, Republicans and Loyalists and others have done thousands of years of jail over the last, you know, terms of the Troubles. But British soldiers haven't. But the agents of the Crown, the forces of the Crown, and the judiciary have been part and parcel of ensuring that nobody would be brought to justice on the British side. Very unfortunate.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. And I think that's why these forums are so important, because we get such a, you know, one-sided media in this, on this side of the Irish Sea, and it's just you know, we always need reminding of that collusion and the role of the British state. Right, I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in, and with apologies to Austin, Robert and John, I'm going to try and combine your questions into one, which is they're all about what a 32 county Ireland will look like, and potentially concerns about the National Health Service. You know, that there is no NHS in Ireland, there is in the six. In a united Ireland, would health provision resemble that of the NHS, and also reference to housing, trade union rights, and so on. So it's about, you know, really, to sum it up, is how would a united Ireland be a step towards socialist change? So for sort of some of the bread and butter issues we campaign on in the Labour Party, health, housing, etc. What are the prospects? How does this relate in terms of a united Ireland? Francie, come to you first.
Okay, well, I suppose how it will look. That's what we want the discussion to start. Sinn Fein don't own this, and shouldn't. We will play our part within it. We have our vision of what we would want within it, but it's something that has to become the ownership of everyone in Ireland and outside of Ireland. Because we want to have the Irish diaspora across the world involved in this discussion. We want them to have votes within this discussion, and we want the Labour Party to become part in the discussion. Not to document it any more than Sinn Fein, but for simply to have vision and to be part and parcel of looking at what a new Ireland should look like. As I've said, we don't want just the 6 counties to be added on to the 26 and we go back to square one. So I think it is a very important discussion that needs to happen. We want to see, for instance, on the health service, we want to see one good All-Ireland health service where it's free at the point of entry, that people actually have a service which they have paid into and that they actually get the benefits from. And even within the United Ireland, we want to see the benefits within United Ireland for those in the north who have paid into the NHS, who have paid into the pension funds, who have paid into all the rest of it, that we still want to be able to get the benefits. And that's not unusual. No, that's not something that we're asking that didn't happen in every other country around the world where the colonial power actually left. But the one thing about it, people, and no disrespect to doctors and nurses, but people in the north and even across the England, Scotland and Wales will talk about the national health, although it is perfect. It's not. And what I have seen in my part of the country is that people can't get into the national health, can't get into the hospitals, can't get GPs. So, it's not something to look up to. It's someone maybe originally which actually had a vision, but it hasn't lived up to it in the present time. And that's not a fault of the doctors and nurses that are working within it. It's a fault of the administration, a fault of the state that actually didn't modernize it as we went along. So we do need to have a proper health service and also an education service right across the board. Like we want to see, a national health and education, so that it's not state schools, religious schools, independent schools, that we should have one education system across the island of Ireland, which is open to everyone, and class, creed, or whatever shouldn't have. Housing is a big one. I come into politics through the civil rights campaign and squatting and picketing outside Kelladon Courthouse whenever those were up for squatting were charged. That's 50 odd years ago now, and yet we're still fighting for housing. We're still fighting for housing rights, and there's still not enough money being put into develop housing, because as we talk about originally, the block grant coming into the north to the assembly does not give enough resources into building new homes. Now, Deirdre Hargey, the Sinn Féin minister, now has reversed some of the decisions where the housing executive will be able to actually start to build houses in the future, but that should never have stopped. And the resources for those houses that were sold off, all that money went back into the British Exchequer. It should have went back into building more homes and future homes and more modern homes for the people. That housing stock is now very old, very poor condition, and we're getting back to the situation of what it was like 50 years ago when people were looking for houses. So certainly the socialist idea, and Sinn Féin is very much prides itself as a socialist party, that we actually want to see implemented. We want to see Irish unity, but we want to see also a democratic socialist republic for the future.
Thanks. Geoff, anything to add?
Yeah, just a bit. I mean, it's sort of quite interesting, that the latest UN survey have said that people of the sort of Southern Irish state are the sort of second happiest people in the world. I mean, I don't. It's quite. I don't want to prettify the sort of Southern Irish state, but I mean, they must be doing something right. Secondly, of course, and we speak here as a member of the British Labour Party, it is obviously not our business what sort of state a 32 county people Ireland want to create. It's up to the people those 30 counties to decide. But at the same time, I mean, I think we have to say, and this is what I think both Francis as I and indeed Rachel said as well, I think it is very important that the Labour Party can play a role, right? Play a role in saying, how can we help to sort of build this sort of 30 county state? How can we help? And I mean, obviously the transfer of social service payments and all that sort of thing is an obvious stake to propose. So let's have that sort of conversation. Let's open up that sort of conversation within the Labour Party about how we can help them and sort of so on. And the sort of the main issue of this, and I mean, no one wants to be, and as Sir Francis just said, no one wants to be, you know, to describe, if you like, as an Irish nationalist, you know. But I don't think either Francis or I are Irish nationalists. We want the national question done with, sorted, got away with, right? Finished. Because that, if you like, in a sense, has divided the Irish people, right? So let's try and sort it out. Let's try and finish it once and for all. Take it off the agenda, right? And the only way to do that is have a 30 county Ireland. And once it's off the agenda, then obviously the possibilities for discussing these things and for having solutions on the housing, on low pay, on the health service, and sort of all that become much easier and much clearer, because, you know, the national question is sort of sorted and solved, right? And that, I think, is if you like, one of the sort of reasons, because it will allow social economic questions to come much more to the fore in the 32 counties of Ireland than they actually ever have been.
Thank you. And
one of the wee points, just Rachel, sorry for coming back in again, but people often ask us, you know, how could you afford to unite Ireland? You know, the people of the South couldn't afford to unite Ireland, and one of the things that we keep saying is, we don't need what the British state needs. We don't need a royal family. We don't need an army that's fighting wars all over the world. We don't want to be part of that. So cut that out of the bill. But before we get our block grant to the Assembly, the British government take out a proportion of that money that's allocated to the Assembly, and they set that aside for what they want to do with it. So we want an independent, neutral state which actually doesn't need armies to defend it and not fighting wars around the world. And I think in that way we can actually create a better socialist state.
Yeah, thank you so much. And before I'm going to come back to Geoff and then Francie for just some very quick closing remarks. And apologies, we've gone on slightly longer than intended, just because there were so many great questions coming in, and we don't get to discuss them in the Labour movement very often. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us, and still well over 100 people sort of taking part in this discussion. Please do make a donation to Labour Outlook so that we can continue to put on events like this and increase our web presence, put on more events. I hope you have learned a lot from this event. I know I have, and understand why we, you know, do need to up our game in terms of bringing this discussion into the Labour movement in Britain. Make sure you follow Labour Outlook on Twitter and Facebook. There's been links in the chat, and keep up to date with what's going on. Please support the work of Labour for Irish unity and all those working for peace and justice in Ireland, and use the channels of the Labour Party, the National Policy Forum, annual conference, etc., to, you know, bring this discussion into the party. I'll come to you, Geoff, and then over to Francie to finish up. So Geoff.
Sorry, what do you want me to say?
I want you to
closing remarks.
Please sum up why Socialists support a united Ireland, which you've already so eloquently explained, and maybe some key action points for the next.
Right. Well, I mean, as I said, I think as far as action point is, I think over the next sort of year or two, we will be, in fact, we have been circulating model resolutions. So I think the most important thing is to try and get this on the mainstream agenda of the party as a whole, of the CLPs. I mean, I do quite a lot of meetings sort of CLP, so I can sort of do these sort of anytime people sort of want me to sort of do them. So I think that's that is the that is something which obviously, hopefully, the people listening here today and watching here today can sort of help with. Let's make Ireland an issue, as they used to say. I mean, as a final statement, if you like. I mean, we sort of come back to this, the importance of what people have said about raising the issues of imperialism within the British labour movement, you know. And it's vital, because once we raise these issues, once we see the relevance of these issues, you know, the relevance of what Karl Marx and what many socialist leaders and many sort of feminist leaders have said throughout the years, is that we are actually helping, we in the sense of the English labour movement, right, are actually helping to free ourselves, because we are breaking with racism, we are breaking with prejudice, we are breaking with discrimination, we are breaking with this sort of identification with the British state. And this is the thing we have to break. And if we don't break with that, then we never achieve socialism in our country either.
Thank you. Francie.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to take part in the discussion, and I enjoyed it. It's something we should do more regularly around various different issues. I think it is very important. And I think, you know, if I was saying to the Labour Party members, and so everybody gets disillusioned sometimes at different things not being able to get. But I remember when back at the Labour Party conferences years ago, and with for Blair come in and various different leaders come into place. And I think it was a lot better discussion, a lot better party position at that time. As Geoff has actually said, the Labour Party position was a lot stronger at that time. So I think we have to get back into that. There was a sort of a fear. And I can understand whenever the conflict situation went on, people had fears, and that's over. Now we have an opportunity for actually to open up the debate and become part of the discussion, to open up that discussion. So I would say to members, you know, open the discussion up, you know, be controversial. Let's have the debate and say this has been very frank today, and I say things which are frank, and sometimes, you know, people say too frank on one thing, but we do have to have that discussion and opened up within it. They open the debates within the party and within the structures. Get motions to conference, because that's where it gets attention, and attending conferences. Sometimes people, as I said, become disillusioned and don't go and don't raise the issue, but that's where it has to be done. The party has to change its policies through its conference. Same with Sinn Fein and Ardèche. You know, if we hadn't put forward the idea of taking our seats in the Dáil and in the elections, we wouldn't be the party that we are today in the south of Ireland or in the north of Ireland. So it is very important. And I suppose from both our point of view, both from Sinn Féin's point of view, from Labour's point of view, is putting socialism into action is the next step. Thank you very much for putting.
Lovely. Thanks, Francie, and thanks, Geoff. And thanks everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.